Thanks everyone for coming in. So I'll be talking about colonization and social policy, which is a book project. It is supposed to come out mid next year. It has been reviewed, but I'd like to have your more feedback on this. So if I can improve it further. So so this book aims to examine the role of civil service for social policy development and analysis in three South Asian countries, which is Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, from colonial to post-colonial era. Basically takes a more critical approach to social policy formulation by colonial and post-colonial civil service. And I'll talk more about it, that how colonial civil service and post-colonial civil service played a very important role in the social development and social policy development and analysis in South Asia. So it draws on the evidence which is presented in the book. I'm developing a relationship or a theory of interaction between bureaucratic regimes and welfare regimes of Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. So these are the key questions which I'm looking at in the book. What was the difference in social policies between the formal and informal sector in the colonial India, and what was the role of Indian civil service in shaping them? To what extent has this role changed over a period of time, and how much social policies in these three countries differ or resemble from those that were present in the colonial era, and in what ways the civil service influenced and played a role in the social policy development in these three countries. All right. There is a motivation on the book. I have got slides on that. We can discuss about the motivations, but due to the time constraints, I'm not going to tell everything, but we could certainly discuss that in Q&A session. So importantly, the current theoretical frameworks, which explains the social policy analysis in development in the global South, they lack explanatory powers. The closest framework which we have currently at the moment is the global welfare regimes framework of Ian Goff and Wood. But again, we have recently conducted a study. We did find that it again cannot tell us everything about the global welfare regime present in developing countries. So what I'm doing in this book is I'm taking a different approach and looking at for colonial and post-colonial bureaucracy and its role, that how that civil service played a role in the development of social policy analysis. Basically, I'm identifying an institution, a very important institution that played a role in social policy development in South Asia. The role of bureaucracy, it has been extensively discussed in the discipline of public administration. We have got massive literature available. It's a whole top discipline. Again, we have got numerous studies that describe the role of colonial and post-colonial bureaucracies in South Asia, right? Then we have got various studies that discuss social policy in South Asia, which is like we do not have a very comprehensive study on this topic, but we do have some chapters, independent articles on social policy in South Asia. But there's no study which looks at the role of civil service, more precisely the Indian civil service, in the development of social policy in this region. So this is a gap in the literature. Now, in terms of theoretical contribution, what I'm doing in this book is I'm stipulating a theory of a bureaucratic regime. So I'm looking at the role of civil service through the lens of a bureaucratic regime, and how that bureaucratic regime interacts with a welfare regime. So we do have welfare regimes which are currently used for the analysis of social policy in these global South countries, and more specifically India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And basically, this is a step forward for developing a framework for social policy analysis in global South by identifying a very important institution, which is the Indian civil service. Empirically, the book provides a historically informed comparison of social policies of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, examining through the lens of civil service and post-colonial era, colonial and post-colonial era. And it opens up scope for future investigations. and more importantly, it can foster collaboration between public administration scholars and social policy, development studies, and social policy scholars. And more importantly, it has got some recommendations for policymakers, civil society organizations, which play an important role in the welfare in these developing countries. Before I move forward, there are some definitional issues, just to clarify. So basically, regime, I'm using the term bureaucratic and welfare regime. So welfare regime is a very known concept, almost, I think it's a very used concept in social policy literature. It refers to a set of rules, institutions, structures, interest that constrains individual through compliance procedures. And when we look at Global South, we do find two major types of regimes: informal security and insecurity regimes, in addition to prototype welfare states, which are largely present in the developed world. I'll talk more about these at the end of the presentation. Bureaucratic regime. It's a concept which has not been used in the literature so far. We, along with one of my colleagues from India, she may have joined. So we have developed this concept of bureaucratic regime very recently, and the work is under review. So basically, it's a governance system characterized by a set of rules, institutions, norms, values, culture, traditions, and shared interests that collectively shape the functioning of any bureaucracy to produce policy outcomes. Now, when we talk of regime, it implies the concept of path dependency. And this is the theoretical lens which I'm using in this book, Comparative Historical Institutionalism, in which path dependency is a relevant concept. So I'm using this lens because it's an approach to study real-life empirical cases. It is historical in its orientation and provides attention to the ways in which institutions structure and behavior and outcomes. And basically, when we talk of path dependency, it refers to the idea that past events and decisions can significantly influence our future course of action. Comparative analysis, which I'm doing in this book, is critical because institutions can be fully understood in relation to the other institutions in a historical context. And in this book, I'm looking at the role of Indian civil service pre to post-colonial eras, and I'm comparing that institution of civil service within these three countries. So it is quite a useful lens of analyzing the Indian civil service. All right, I'd like to have your views, because power resource theory is again a very useful framework, but I haven't used it in the book so far. So if you've got any suggestions that if it can be a useful lens for this analysis, I'd like to have your feedback on this. All right, case selection. Now, Shashi Tharoor, he has written a lot on colonization in India. He argues that colonization of India is marked by economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and political subjugation. Mahmood Mamdani recently, in his seminal work, talks about that. He argues that colonial structures, institutions are an obstacle for structural transformation to overcome global and local inequalities in post-colonial world. And then we need to look at what are those structures. What are those structures which obstruct the emergence of equal world in most of global South countries? So here is very important structure and institution, which is the Indian civil service. Now, the focus on Indian civil service is because it was a service which was created, and I'll talk more about it, during the time of colonization. But it is one of those services, it's the only service amongst, I think police is the other service, which has its offshoots in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So it was divided after partition. In 1947, it got the partition of India. Pakistan got Pakistan Administrative Service, or at that time it was called Civil Service of Pakistan, and it was branched into Indian Administrative Service. And after the partition of Pakistan in 1971, it was further divided into Bangladesh Administrative Service. So this is one service which was bifurcated after partition. So more importantly, this service have similar colonial legacy, similar kind of structures present to date as was created back in 1854, 1857. Similar hierarchical structures, similar postings, similar kind of welfare benefits with some minor modifications in the power structure. It's still the same. And it is the core civil service in all these three countries. Officers of this service hold the most important positions in all these three countries. The most important one. Well, I'll discuss that later. All right. Let's discuss with the colonial era. Now, this is coming from the Provincial Gazetteer in 1870. So this was the structure which was created by the Britishers to administer India. Now, what you can see here is some. Is the pointer works? All right. So here, the chief commissioner was the head of the province, right? Followed by divisions. A division normally used to have 2 or 3 districts, which is the same in these 3 countries, with some differences. Then there were districts, which was administered by a deputy commissioner. Divisions used to be administered or looked after by the commissioners, and here we had the chief secretaries. And in the under the districts, we used to have subdivisions, which was administered by the assistant commissioners. More importantly, there was no oversight of any kind of political leadership till 1935, from 1858 onwards. And the departments were administered by the secretaries, again, without any oversight of the political leadership. Now, whatsoever was done by these people. And almost till 1924, all of these major positions were occupied by the officers of Indian Civil Service. All right. Now, so from 1858 to 1947, India was governed by almost 196 acts. The civil service was formed by the Act of 1858, which was the legal document which created Indian Civil Service, and it was headed by the Secretary of the State in the British Parliament, and the officers were answerable to the Secretary of the State in London. Now, initially, the Indian Civil Service was reserved for the British citizens. But after the First World War, due to the shortage of manpower, when most of the people were sent to fight the war, the Britishers thought that the local Indians should also be included in the civil service. So in 1924, the Central Superior Service was created, where the officers were allowed, so people in India were allowed to compete for the central examinations. And from there on, there was a minor participation of the local Indians in the civil service, but majority came from England. Now, the officers of the ICS, as I mentioned before, they held the most important field and secretariat assignments, which included secretary, chief secretaries, deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners, etc. Now, so the ICS officers above the district level had the officers who were posted in the secretariats. They formulated the policies regarding health, education, law and order. So they formulated the policy without any political oversight. And it was the field officers, the deputy commissioners, who were responsible to implement the policies. But more importantly, they used to send reports to the chief commissioner, which was onward sent to the British Parliament, which they formed the basis of any kind of policy in colonial India. Now, according to Prime Minister Lloyd George, the Indian Civil Service was a steel frame, the institution that built up the British Raj. They had around 1,200 officials, which administer 350 million population in India. All right, this is a bit important. What you can see here is the expenditure and income data of from 1869 to 1904 of one of the provinces, right? So what we can see here is the, if you can see the expenditure, right? It is the percentage, right? So we see the general administration, which is 16%, 8%, 8%, followed by judicial, police, and jails. So it accounts for like 70, 58, and 52% over a period of time. Now, This general administration also included the salaries and other perks and privileges which was enjoyed by these ICS officers. This included that. But more importantly, what we can infer from here is that most of the expenditure which was done at that time was mainly focused on maintenance of law and order and judicial administration, nothing else. And when we look at the income here, except from the forest, all the revenue collection was done by the deputy commissioner. So all these powers of revenue collection, land revenue, excise stamps, it used to be invested in the office of deputy commissioner. He was responsible. So this was the power of this office, how they administered India. Now, more importantly, there was no oversight that what kind of benefits they get from this kind of expenditure. It is quite evident that, again, Shashi Tharoor, he writes, in the first decades of 20th century, the imbalance in salaries and emoluments was so great that 8,000 British officers earned around 13 million pounds, while the 130,000 Indian in-government servants in lower ranks were only paid around 3.2 million pounds. This was the discrepancy. And more importantly, Biegert, he writes, the starting salary of 450 per month in 1928 of a young Indian member of service could afford to keep 2 polo ponies, a car, and 6 servants. While the salaries of collectors, which is the deputy commissioner, starting at rupees 1,000, drawn from the 5th or 6th year of his service, or commissioners rupees 3,000, drawn from perhaps the 22nd year, and so on and so forth. But it was a very, very impressive way of living. And in addition to all this salary, these pictures can just a very minor portrayal of the kind of perks these people enjoyed. And mind you, they haven't changed much. Even in the contemporary world, it largely remains the same. I'll talk about it. In addition to all this, these people, the servants, they had public pensions, sickness benefits, unemployment insurance, group insurance, transport, houses, and servants, all available to them, coming from the budgetary expenditure which I just showed you. And more importantly, they could have cars, and there was no oversight. The only oversight which they had was the audit which was done, but again, audit office was under their control. Auditors were under their control. Anyway, so this was a bit about Indian civil service and the kind of welfare benefits they enjoyed. Let's look at what was going on in the rest of India. Now, there was an Indian Famine Commission report which was published which was debated in 1902 in the British Parliament, and some of the findings were that 40 million people in India who traveled from cradle to grave had not enough to eat a single meal. Half of the agricultural population never knew from years to year's end what it is to have their hunger fully satisfied. And according to Biegert, the deliberation and consciousness bleeding of India by England for 150 years was to make the Indian nation subservient in every possible way. I'll talk a bit about more this argument, because it allowed a social construction of populations in a certain way, which is so important in contemporary world. However, one of the commissioner reported back in 1888, when the famine was at its peak, that there is little to no poverty existed in the province. So this was the obliviousness of the civil service from the local populace. All right, let's talk about famines. Now, I'm just taking the example of famines just to show you that what was the level of poverty which was there in British India. So approximately 25 major famines occurred during British Raj. You can see here that they occurred almost in every part of India, right? And around 25 million Indians are believed to have died in famines, compared to only 5 million deaths throughout the entire wars from 1793 to 1900. And now, the British officers, they reported that the famines were caused by food shortages. So this is what was the reports which was sent by the field officer to the commissioners and to the British Parliament. And what was the result? The result was the focus was on temporary relief. The maximum focus during these famines were that people should provided with some kind of temporary relief, some kind of food, right? And what we see is a scheme of ration card, which was started after 1943 famine, like after the last famine in India, which in the colonial times. But it was Amartya Sen back in 1981 who argued in his work that it was not the famines were not caused by food shortages, rather the entitlement failures, which gives us to the idea of poverty. So essentially, he talked about that it is the poverty which caused famine, not the food shortages. But the reports which were sent were slightly different because, again, there are scholars who argue that most of the officers who were sending these reports were trying to imply the Western theories upon the colonized South Asian region, and one of those theory was Malthus theory of food shortage, which implied that famines are caused by shortage in food. But in the period, there was no system of welfare which was developed. The only prominent welfare, not the welfare mechanism, but the only way of providing some kind of relief was through public works programs. Now, the public works programs was an initiative which started, again, if you going back to that, here, what we can see is we can see some kind of expenditure done on public works, right? Now, public works schemes basically involved construction of roads, industries, providing some relief during famine, so on and so forth. So by no means it was a social welfare system. It was just a means of providing some kind of informal employment by the state during that time period. And again, the conditions were very, very harsh. But again, there was no kind of employment benefit which was given to these people who worked in these public work programs. It was just on daily wages. They were given some money and that was it. No sickness benefits, no pensions, no insurance, nothing else. Now, there was a mechanism of informal support, which was done through missionaries, religious organizations, families, etc. during that time period. But again, that was limited to certain groups. And there's a lot of literature which talks about the effectiveness of the informal support. So what kind of patterns do we get about the social welfare during colonial era? So ICS basically, and this is some of the emergent patterns, some of the conclusions which I have drawn. So ICS was created for the maintenance of law and order and extraction of resources. Social welfare for the informal sector was never a priority. The significant power resources at the disposal of ICS allowed them to formulate welfare policies for their benefits. Comprehensive welfare policies for informal sector never developed in colonial India. And they were highly disproportionate social policies where informal sector was neglected and focused on providing temporary relief in times of crisis. More importantly, what these kind of policies, what they did, they constructed the population in a certain way. They constructed the population in a way where the poor populace started getting a feeling that the public service or the ICS is the only service which is eligible for generous welfare benefits, and we should only rely on meager support. This is important because in contemporary India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, this continues to be the state of affairs. All right. Again, we don't have time to discuss all three countries, and again, it's a work in progress. But I've finished work on Pakistan, so just quickly tell you what I've founded in Pakistan's case. So ICS became the Indian Administrative Service. It was renamed as Civil Service of Pakistan soon after partition, and in 1971, when Bangladesh got independence, it became Bangladesh Administrative Service. Again, the power structure, welfare benefits, they remained the same after the independence in 1947. And almost now, when Pakistan got independence, in Pakistan's case, every colonial law related to land, judiciary, administration, and even the constitution, the first constitution which Pakistan adopted, they were adopted from the period of colonization. Very less changes. We can discuss in detail, but the Government of India Act of 1935, majority of its provisions became the constitution of first constitution of Pakistan. So they there was not much change, and the civil service it remained the most prime service in Pakistan as of today. Just to give you one figure, in 2022, around 20,262 candidates appeared for the service exam, and only 37 went into the service. I'll leave the calculations of percentages up to you. So after the partition, Pakistan had a very fragile political situation, political and economic situation, which led to successive fall of governments and ultimately the imposition of martial law back in 1958. Now, that was the time period from 1950, and because of that lack of political stability, weak economic situation, bureaucracy gained its more power, and it became even more powerful than it was in the colonial period. That was the time when it became the most powerful, and people like General Skandar Mirza, General Ayub, who were the first two dictators, they gave even more powers to legitimize their rule or to suppress the local population through civil service. And again, civil service office used to have deputy commissioner office in that time period used to have judicial, executive, magisterial powers. We can discuss more. So the civil service in Pakistan, it underwent two set of reforms since 1947. The first was done by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the first elected prime minister, democratic prime minister in 1973, and then the President General Musharraf in 2001. Reforms led to minor changes in the service with some kind of removal of powers, but largely the structure remains the same. It's the same structure which I showed you, right? It's the level of assistant commissioners, deputy commissioners, secretaries. It remains the same, but there was some minor differences, some minor reforms which were done, which was done to the service. But the point important to note here is that once these reforms are done, the people who are doing these reforms or heading these reform commissions are the bureaucrats, are the people from these services. So the saying goes that you do not chop off the hand which feeds you. It was very relevant in this particular case. Again, they hold the same kind of positions. In a fragile democracy like Pakistan, they continue to play a very critical role. Same is the welfare benefits, which they get. It's the same. Big houses, servants, pensions, it hasn't changed much. They occupy the same positions. What else? So yeah. When it comes to the informal sector, almost 70% of the workforce in Pakistan works in the informal sector, right? 70%. Now, until 2007, there was no social protection strategy of the country. So it was in 2007 when the first social protection strategy was formed, which argued for providing some kind of welfare benefits or comprehensive welfare benefits to the informal sector. But still, the spending which is done on the flagship social protection program in Pakistan remains very, very low. Okay, so this is from this. I did this study back in 2017, along with my colleague at Crawford. So this is 2004. The first national social protection strategy was formed in 2007. So if you can see it, what was the condition in 2004? Now, it does not show you the kind of perks and benefits which are enjoyed by the officers, but what it does show you is the pension expenditure. Now, the pension expenditure still remains the largest social protection expenditure in Pakistan, even in 2004. Now, pension is one of many benefits which public servants enjoy. Right now, once we say 0.5% includes all the public service, but a majority of this goes to the Pakistan Administrative Service because their officers are higher in rank, and as a result, they get much larger share. But if you look at the other programs, the spending remains very, very, very low. Zakat, Baitul Mal, and mostly these are private programs. But still, they were following this legacy of public works. So this was named as Human Capital Accumulation Program, the TABANA. Again, the expenditure was low, but even in that, the largest expenditure was going towards pensions, which is exclusively for the civil service. Now, this is recent data from 2022. Again, a recent study which I did. Here, what we can see is that this is the Benazir Income Support Program in Pakistan, is the largest social protection program. and look at the welfare spending. Now, this is for almost 70% of the population in the country, or even more than that. And it is only 0.18%. When you compare it with the pension expenditure, which is just here, which is 0.9. So this is again so disproportionate, even after the formulation of the flagship social assistance program in the country. So again, what we can see here is that the spending remains very disproportionate. Public pensions remains the highest expenditure, accounting for a very, very small workforce. When we look at the informal workforce, which requires more welfare benefits, the spending remains very low. And it's largely because that we have in Pakistan, we have the issue of resources, but again, there are other issues which I just discussed that which accounts for this low spending. So what are some of the emerging patterns? Successive military takeovers and weak democracy allowed civil service to retain its powers and structures. It played and is continuing to play a key role in social policy making and implementation for their benefits. It's a very dominant policy actor in the country's landscape. International organizations do play a role in adopting measures for the informal sector, but it is constrained by low fiscal space, and coverage remains a major issues, and social policies in Pakistan disproportionately favors the elite. Okay, this is the more theoretical part of it. So what I found is, and this is a conceptualization which I've come up with, is the idea of a kleptocratic bureaucratic regime. So initially I talked about the idea of a bureaucratic regime. Here what we find in Pakistan is a kleptocratic bureaucratic regimes. And some of the features of this regime which is coming from the evidence from Pakistan, is it receives substantial benefits, privileges that have got high financial implications, which exert considerable strain on public sector's budgetary resources. Lavish expenditure does not yield the anticipated dividends in the form of effective and successful policy outcomes, and it's marked by widespread policy failures across various critical sectors. Now, how does this kleptocratic regime interacts with a welfare regime? Now, Pakistan largely resembles a feature of an informal security regime, where people rely on informal networks to meet their needs. Recently, what we have found in our study is that Pakistan largely represents the feature of informal security regime, but it does represents the feature of more effective and welfare state regime. So it's kind of a hybrid regime. But the dominant one in Pakistan, around 67% of the population can be categorized as informal security regime. What does this kleptocratic regime does? So this kleptocratic regime basically obstructs the movement from an informal security regime to a welfare state regime or a more effective state regime. So this is the hypothesis which I'm drawing from this study from Pakistan's case. So essentially, the aim of any kind of regime would be to have people which enjoy the benefit of a welfare state regime, right? So what happens in this particular case is that this kind of bureaucratic regime which is present, it is obstructing the movement from one regime to another, from lower to a higher regime. So this is the hypothesis which I have drawn from this study. So again, do not have time to discuss Bangladesh and India. So what are the emerging conclusions and implications for this? In Pakistan's case, there's a path-dependent civil service, which can be categorized as a kleptocratic regime, which includes the formulation of inclusive social policies. A civil service as an institution, or the concept of bureaucratic regimes, needs to be discussed in the analysis of social policy, more specifically in global social policy literature, as well as welfare regime literature, because it hasn't been discussed as extensively. And there is a need for more inclusive or bureaucratic reforms, especially in Pakistan's case, which as far as the evidence which we have gathered so far. That's it. Thank you.